ونؤمن به توكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أما بعد. As we are now in the month of Ramadan, we inshallah will spend more time engaging with the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the Quran. And I want to start this week with looking at Surah al-Baqarah. Just very briefly going over the virtues and the themes and the core lessons of Surah al-Baqarah. And the reason why I want to focus on Surah al-Baqarah today is multiple. One reason being that we probably heard the surah a lot this week. Right? Almost every night of Taraweeh for the first few nights, you'll hear Surah al-Baqarah. And have we taken time to understand? Have we taken time to reflect on it? Have we taken time to internalize its message? Another reason I chose Surah al-Baqarah is that I feel like the longest surahs of the Quran are often overlooked. That we see a surah, it looks too long, so we don't spend enough time with it. We only want to go for the short surahs because it's easier. Surah al-Baqarah is the longest surah in the Quran. It's almost 2.5 juz, right? It's the longest surah in the Quran. And a lot of people don't recite it enough, they don't study its tafsir, they don't reflect on it. And this is a mistake. Because Surah al-Baqarah is one of the most blessed and one of the most important surahs in the Quran. It is a summary of the entire Quran's message in one surah. And this is a surah that has a lot of virtues attached to it. It is a surah that was very close to the hearts of the Sahaba. We know that there are some Sahaba who spent 10 years just studying Surah al-Baqarah. Just taking a verse and studying it and memorizing it and implementing it and then moving on to the next and just focus on Surah al-Baqarah for years. We know there were Sahaba who recited the entire Surah al-Baqarah in one rak'ah of salah, and that was the daily practice. This surah was beloved to them. This surah is a very important surah. It was revealed in the early years of Medina, and it summarizes some of the core themes of Islam. But before we get into the theme of Surah al-Baqarah, let's look at the actual virtues of Surah al-Baqarah. There are actually many ahadiths that praise Surah al-Baqarah and explain to us some of its virtues. To begin, Abi Hurairah radiallahu anhu قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا تجعلوا بيوتكم مقابر إن الشيطان ينفر من البيت الذي تقرأ فيه سورة البقرة. The Prophet ﷺ stated, as narrated by Abu Hurairah and recorded in Sahih Muslim, do not turn your homes into graveyards. The devils flee from a house in which Surah al-Baqarah is recited. So a very important virtue of Surah al-Baqarah is that it is a ruqya. It is a means of chasing away the evil jinn and shayateen. That if someone feels the presence of shaitans or jinn in their homes, one of the most effective solutions is to recite Surah al-Baqarah. You sit and you recite Surah al-Baqarah from beginning to end. The Prophet ﷺ promised that shaitans flee from a house in which Surah al-Baqarah is recited. Interestingly, one of my teachers was a convert. He spent over 20 years doing da'wah to his parents. And his mother was a Christian. She was a very staunch Christian. And the moment she converted after 20 plus years there was a jinn in her room. And she called many Christian priests to come and get rid of the jinn. And whatever the Christian priest did didn't work. And her son came in. He's a sheikh, a famous sheikh. He came in and he recited the entire Surah al-Baqarah, and the jinn never came back. That's when his mother took a shahada and converted to Islam. This is a very effective ruqya. It's a very powerful surah. And even individual pieces of it are ruqya. Ayat al-Kursi, the last two verses of Surah al-Baqarah, these verses alone are very powerful. Right? And that takes me to the second virtue of Surah al-Baqarah. It contains within it the greatest verse in the Quran. There are many ahadiths that tell us that Ayat al-Kursi is the greatest verse of the Quran. And Ayat al-Kursi is in Surah al-Baqarah. So this is not just a powerful surah, but this is a powerful surah that contains within it the most important of verses. And we'll need an entire khutbah to discuss what is Ayat al-Kursi and why it's the greatest and most important of verses. But essentially it summarizes for us who Allah is and what our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be, which is the central message of the Quran. Another important hadith that highlights some of the virtues of Surah al-Baqarah قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله كتب كتابا قبل أن يخلق السماوات والأرض بألف عام أنزل منه آيتين ختم بها سورة البقرة ولا يقران في دار 3 ليال ويقربها الشيطان. The Prophet ﷺ stated that Allah decreed 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years before He created the heavens and earth. He decreed 2,000 years before He created the heavens and earth, and He set down 2 verses at the end of Surah al-Baqarah. If they are recited for 3 nights in a row, Shaitan will not come near you. So this hadith has multiple parts. The first part talks about the qadr of Allah, which was said thousands of years before the heavens and earth was created. But the second part is about Surah al-Baqarah, or specifically the last 2 verses of Surah al-Baqarah. There are many hadiths about the virtues of the last 2 verses of Surah al-Baqarah, and it states that if you recite it for 3 nights in a row, Shaitan won't come near your home. So again, the ruqya of Surah al-Baqarah mentioned in this hadith. In another lengthier version of this hadith, actually it's a different hadith, but lengthier hadith that gives you multiple virtues of Surah al-Baqarah in one hadith, right? قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم اقرأوا القرآن فإنه يأتي يوم القيامة شفاء لأصحابه. The Prophet ﷺ said, recite the Quran regularly, because it will be an intercessor on the day of judgment for those who are its companions, who are the Ashab al-Quran, the Sahaba of the Quran. What is the Ashab al-Quran? Somebody who is attached to the Quran. Rasulullah ﷺ said you should recite the Quran regularly, because if you are attached to the Quran will intercede on your behalf on the day of judgment. And then he said, Iqra'u Zahrawain, Baqarah wa Surah al-Imran. Recite the 2 beautiful surahs, the 2 brightly illuminated surahs, Baqarah and al-Imran. The second and third surah of the Quran. 2 surahs we tend to overlook because they're very long. The Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to recite them regularly, and he called them 2 lights. They illuminate your heart, they illuminate your life with their message. And he said, فَإِنَّهُمَ تَأْتِيَانِ يَوْمُ الْقِيَامَةِ كَأَنَّهُمْ غَمَامَتَانِ. That on the day of judgment, these 2 surahs will come in the form of 2 clouds, or 2 shades, or 2 flocks of birds, pleading for their companions. Meaning, Surah Baqarah and Surah al-Imran will intercede on the day of judgment for those who love these surahs. If you are someone whose heart is attached to these 2 surahs and you recite them regularly, they will intercede for your behalf on the day of judgment. And it's interesting, it's narrated that Usman radiallahu anhu in 2 rakats of salah, he will read Surah Baqarah in the first rakat and Surah al-Imran in the second rakat. And he was attached to these surahs. So there are 4 blessings mentioned. I'm sorry, I've now finished the hadith yet, right? It then goes on to continue. He says, Iqra'u Surah Baqarah, فَإِنَّ أَخْزَهَا بَرَكَةً وَتَرْكَهَا حَسَرًا وَلَا تَسْتَدِيُهَا بَطَرًا. The Prophet ﷺ then said, read Surah Baqarah, because taking it is barakah, and leaving it is a source of regret. And the sahils, the people of magic, those who do sihr, they have no power over it. So this hadith mentions 4 virtues of Surah Baqarah. Number 1, it intercedes for you on the day of judgment. Number 2, it has barakah in it. The Prophet ﷺ, whoever recites it regularly, taking that will bring barakah to your life. You want barakah in your home, recite Surah Baqarah often. Leaving it is a source of regret. Those who abandon Surah Baqarah, the Prophet ﷺ described their homes like graveyards. It's like the hearts are dead and the homes are dead because the light of the Quran is not in it. And finally, again, the ruqya aspect, that it overpowers any sihr. No one can do magic on you. No one can do the evil eye on you. Any of these things, if you're reciting Surah Baqarah regularly, it overpowers all of this. So there are many, many virtues of Surah Baqarah. Really, there are a lot more hadiths that I can go through, but then the whole khutbah will just be the narration of these hadiths. This will suffice for today. The Surah Baqarah is a blessed surah. It is a ruqya. It is a surah that the Prophet ﷺ described as a cloud that will come and intercede on the day of judgment. It is a surah that we have been told over and over again in the hadith to recite it regularly, to reflect on it regularly. But what is the surah about? The Surah al-Baqarah, we can say that this surah is, in its essence, a summary of the entire Quran. That the first 2.5 juz of the Quran summarizes the rest of the Quran. And so, the Quran begins with Surah al-Fatiha, which summarizes the whole message of the Quran in 7 lines. And then it has Surah al-Baqarah, which summarizes the entire message of the Quran in about 50 pages. Surah al-Baqarah, we can divide it into 2 parts. The first part is faith, the second part is the law. And they go hand in hand. That to get to Jannah, you have to have faith and you have to obey the law. And what you will find in Surah al-Baqarah is a detailed description of how different people react to the faith, and then a detailed description of all the laws of Islam. That if you want to study the laws of Islam, this is the most comprehensive surah. It covers everything. You will find verses in Surah al-Baqarah about marriage and divorce. You will find verses in Surah al-Baqarah about the death penalty and criminal law. You will find verses in Surah al-Baqarah about jihad fi sabilillah. You will find verses in Surah al-Baqarah about Hajj. Every aspect of law is covered in the surah. But the surah begins and it ends with a discussion about faith. Because the law is built upon faith. The faith is the foundation. If you don't have faith, you're not going to take the law seriously, you're not going to follow it. And so the surah begins telling us that only those who have true faith will truly benefit from the Quran. That there's no doubt in this book. It's a guidance for those who fear Allah. And then it describes to us the 3 types of human beings in their relationship with the Quran. That people are of 3 types in their relationship with the Quran. They are those who believe. Allah gives us a detailed description of the believer. Then there are those who reject the message and their hearts are sealed, and they are the people of Jahannam. And then there are those who pretend to believe. And this is the most dangerous of categories. And so Allah gives us a lengthy description of the munafiqun, the hypocrites. What is a munafiq? A munafiq is somebody who is Muslim by name. Outwardly they are Muslim. They may even look like pious Muslims. But in their heart, they are atheists or they are disbelievers. They really don't believe in Islam. It's all just a show. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us about nifaq in details. And these verses of nifaq, one of the mistakes we make is we read these verses and we use it to judge the rest of our communities. Right? This is especially with young overzealous brothers. They're very quick to say, oh, this guy's a munafiq and that guy's a munafiq. No, these verses are meant for introspection. Look into your own heart and see if you have any of the qualities of the munafiq. And so Allah tells us some of these qualities in the beginning of Surah al-Baqarah. That they think that they are reforming. They think that they are making peace. They think they're making the world a better place. But they're just causing more and more corruption. They're just messing things up more and more. That they think what they are doing is good, but it causes more evil. And Allah describes them as those people who think they are better than everybody else. Allah says that they think the people are idiots, but they are the ones who are foolish. They think the people are idiots, but they are the ones who are foolish. So Allah describes the munafiqun in details. And then He gives us stories related to these 3 categories of people. We have the story of the true believers and how faith gives them victory. In the story of King Talut and Dawood alayhi salam and the battle against Goliath, showing us the power of true faith in Surah al-Baqarah. Then we have the stories of the munafiqun. The people around Musa alayhi salam, that they didn't want to follow the law. And they kept trying to find loopholes and twist the law and make it suit them. And no matter how much he warned them, and no matter how much he tried to get them to listen, they kept looking for loopholes. They kept looking for ways out. This is the behavior of the munafiqun. And then we have stories of those who reject Islam, with Fir'aun and Namrud. Right? These 2 kings are mentioned in Surah al-Baqarah as examples of the kinds of people that completely reject Islam. And Allah makes an example of them. And so Surah al-Baqarah is really a holistic look at what does it mean to be a believer. That Allah has sent revelation. There are going to be people who believe in it, people who disbelieve in it, and people who pretend to believe in it. He gives us stories of all 3 types. He gives us descriptions of all 3 types. And then He calls upon us to be amongst the believers. And the final 2 verses of Surah al-Baqarah, which there are many hadiths just about the verses of the virtues of those 2 verses. The final 2 verses of Surah al-Baqarah tell us and remind us to be amongst the true believers. and about the virtues of being amongst the true believers, and that Allah's victory will come to the true believers. And these are two of the most powerful verses in the Quran. As we mentioned earlier, if these verses are ruqya, these verses are blessed, these verses are considered amongst the most powerful verses in the Quran. It was from the practice of Ali radiallahu anhu to recite these verses every night before sleeping. In fact, Ali radiallahu anhu stated, I do not know any intelligent person except that they recite the closing verses of Surah al-Baqarah before sleeping. Meaning, Ali radiallahu anhu considered a sign of intelligence that somebody would recite these verses before going to sleep. And so this was also from the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever recites the closing verses of Surah al-Baqarah at night, it is enough for him. It is enough for him. It is a protection. To recite the closing verse of Surah al-Baqarah before sleeping will protect you from all evil. That this is a very powerful set of verses. So this is in essence what Surah al-Baqarah is about, and the virtue of Surah al-Baqarah. Obviously you cannot cover a surah of this magnitude in one khutbah. I highly recommend each and every one of us make time to recite the surah. Make time to read the translation of the surah. Make time to study the tafsir of the surah. And if you have any spiritual issues in your home, whether it's jinn, or whether it's magic, or whether it's an evil eye, or jealousy, recite Surah al-Baqarah. It is a cure for all of that. We ask Allah to allow us to benefit from what we have recited. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Alhamdulillahi wahda wassalatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da amma ba'd wa inna asdaqal hadithi kitabullah wa khayrul hadi Muhammadin sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa sharrul umuri muhdatsatuha wa kullu muhdatsatin bid'ah wa kullu bid'atin dalalah wa kullu dalalatin finnar. One of the most fascinating aspects of Surah al-Baqarah is that it gives us a detailed description of the laws of Islam, but it also focuses on the wisdom behind the law and the principles behind the law. And so you can learn the goals of the Sharia and the principles of fiqh from Surah al-Baqarah. I'll give you 3 examples of this. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the death penalty in Surah al-Baqarah, right, that for murder, to intentionally murder someone, there is a death penalty in the Sharia. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this in Surah al-Baqarah. And He says in that verse that in qisas, in the death penalty, there is life. In the death penalty, there is life. What does this mean? It means having a death penalty for murder saves lives. Having a death penalty for murder saves lives. It makes society a safer place. We see the result of not having a death penalty in this country. We see how dangerous it is. We see how much fear we live in. And so when Allah revealed the verse, He didn't just say, this is the law. He said, this is the benefit of the law. That if you have this law in your society, this is the benefit. If a society has a death penalty for murder, it will be a safer place. It will be a place where people's lives will be saved. Because if you take the life of one murderer, you save the lives of hundreds of people. And so, this is how Surah al-Baqarah doesn't just tell you the law, but it tells you the wisdom behind the law as well. In a more common example that we all know, in Surah al-Baqarah, when Allah talks about fasting, He doesn't just tell us to fast, but He tells us the wisdom behind fasting. He says, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that your taqwa may increase, so that your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gets stronger. So Allah doesn't just tell us what to do, but He tells us what benefit we're going to get out of it. Another interesting aspect to how Surah al-Baqarah tackles the law is that it doesn't just give us the goal and the benefit of the law, but it gives us the principles behind the law that we can then apply to other aspects of life as well. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again, when He talks about fasting, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah al-Baqarah verse 185, if you are sick or traveling, you can make it up later. And then what does Allah say next? يُرِيدُ اللَّهَ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. Allah wants things to be easy for you. He does not want things to be difficult for you. This is a principle of the Sharia. Right? If you read the verse of fasting in Surah al-Baqarah, it gives us a principle of the Sharia. The principle of taysir. Allah wants ease for you. Allah doesn't want things to be difficult for you. This is why you don't have to fast when you're traveling. This is why you don't have to fast when you're sick. This is why you don't have to fast if you have a chronic illness. But Allah didn't want this religion to be too difficult for you. He wanted it to be manageable. And so an entire genre of literature can be derived from this one statement in the Quran. The statement where Allah said Allah intends ease for you. It gives us a whole methodology of fiqh called Taysir, which is very important for understanding how to apply Islam on a practical level. Likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talks about jihad, fi sabilillah, in Surah al-Baqarah, He doesn't just tell people to fight, but He explains a very important principle that governs all of our law. He says fighting is an obligation upon you and you may not like it. But perhaps you dislike something that is good for you. And perhaps you love something that is bad for you. Allah knows, you don't know. Allah knows, you don't know. This is a fundamental principle governing all of the Sharia. Allah knows, you don't know. That sometimes there are laws in the Sharia that you don't understand. That you think something is good for you, but Allah knows it's bad for you, so He made it haram. Or you think something is bad, but Allah knows it is good, so He made it an obligation. Allah tells you to trust Him and to trust His law. Allah knows what is best for us. Had Allah not legislated jihad, this ummah might have been wiped out many, many times. By the pagans of Makkah, by the Romans, by the Persians, by the Crusaders, by the Mongols, and now too we see it with Israel and their allies. There are always forces in the world trying to wipe out the believers. It is from the wisdom of Allah that He made jihad an obligation against them. But Allah knows what is best for us, so we do not know. And finally, the closing verse, I always go back to the closing verse of Surah al-Baqarah, this blessed verse. Again, Allah gives us that principle of taysir. La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha. Allah never burdens a soul beyond his capacity. Allah never burdens a soul beyond his capacity. There are many angles to this verse. There's the spiritual side, but there's also the legal side, the law. The law that we take from this verse is a principle in fiqh called al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. That difficulty causes the law to ease. Difficulty causes the law to relax a bit. Meaning, if you can't stand and pray, you sit and pray. If you can't fast, you make up the fast later. If you can't make up the fast later, you pay the fidya. There's always some taysir in the Sharia because Allah does not burden you beyond your capacity. Allah does not make things so difficult that it becomes impossible to practice. You can't make wudu, you make tayammum. There's always taysir whenever things get too difficult. And so this concept of taysir is mentioned twice in Surah al-Baqarah. In the verse of fasting, verse 185, and in the closing verse, verse 286. That Allah tells us Allah intends ease for you, He does not intend difficulty for you. And Allah ends the surah by saying Allah will never burden you beyond your capacity. And so from these verses, we derive the methodology of Islamic law. And so you see the depths of Surah al-Baqarah. That in the surah, we have teachings on how to be true believers. We have stories and examples of the true believers. We have the law laid out in details. Then we have the wisdom behind the law explained and the principles behind the law explained, giving us a comprehensive overview of the religion. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to benefit from what has been said. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين